This is Monocle on Design, a show where we discuss everything from architecture and craft to furniture and fashion. I'm Nick Manise. On today's program, we hear from Hanif Kara, this year's Soane Medal winner. We talk engineering, architecture, psychology and more. Plus, a studio visit to a Dutch artistic practice. All that coming up on Monocle on Design. Hanif Kara recently became the first engineer to win the Soane Medal, an annual award typically given to architects by the Sir John Soanes Museum in London. His win is significant on a number of levels. To start, Hanif arrived in the UK as a teenager after his family was expelled from Uganda by the terrifying military dictatorship of Idi Amin. With little English language skills, he experienced academic struggles and failed all his O-levels. Following school, he got a job as a welder before taking night classes that helped him land a spot studying civil engineering at Salford University. After graduation, he worked as an engineer on oil rigs and then roller coasters before ultimately co-founding Act 2 in 1996, a design-led engineering firm. He has since gone on to become the engineer to the Starchitects, working with the likes of Zaha Hadid and David Chipperfield. To discuss his remarkable career and his recent win of the Soane Medal, Hanif joined me at Midori House.
I was surprised and shocked that they had considered it, but equally really pleased that they're far more open-minded than engineers are in the breadth of thinking, given the current state of the world in the many crises and on top of that the climate, that our focus in engineering is too narrow. But for the Soane to pick somebody like me was like drawing in the world and saying, this is a bigger problem and let's speak to many others and give an award to somebody who's trying to do that. My institution congratulated me, and that's the first time in 40 years, ever. Despite the fact I have an OBE and many other awards, this is the first time I've heard from them, which tells me something, to say, well, you should have been awake, because I think that people like the Soane Museum are in touch with what's going on in the world and have been for centuries. But when you go back to Soane, back to 1757 and what the architects were doing, then you suddenly pick up on the bigger mark that architecture and landscape leaves engineers as just enablers for all of that. And I think we haven't caught on to the fact that now we have to lead because of the climate and we have to drive a lot of this kind of work. The Soane was, I think, smart when they picked me. I'm told yesterday that it was unanimous and very quick, which is nice. There was a gathering of generations in the jury that thought I was the right person, and it's been amazing.
I mean, that's fascinating to hear. They said that, to pick an engineer. But you've also talked about the role of the engineer there. I mean, you're saying it needs to change. It needs to stop being about the background, but you also need to be leaders. We do. I think, my colleagues might say that we already are, but I think we're silent about it. And now you can't, with the problem of, in particular, the climate crisis, I think we have to come to the front of the discussion. We've already started in the last 20 years to make a difference. The crisis isn't as bad as it could have been already. And if we can come further forward by changing the way energy works or changing the way embodied energy works in buildings, changing the materials we use, I think rather than responding and solving problems, we're actually initiating ways of thinking for architects and everybody else in the industry, including builders. So we can do that as engineers, and why shouldn't we speak out? Historically, we've just waited until everybody said something, and then we do the numbers and make it stand up, and that's it. It's a binary way, scientists. Whereas now, that single-disciplinary approach to the current crisis of the world ain't going to work. If we're going to have to forget the disciplines and find the biggest transdisciplinary solutions. That's something that's quite fascinating to me, this idea of the disciplines. I mean, you talk about structural engineers being around for 200 years. I'm a landscape architect by training and trade. And the reality is these are all kind of new concepts.
Yes.
And I'm going to throw something a little bit rogue. I want to go back to Vitruvius, who I've been thinking about a little bit. But, he talked about strength, utility and beauty.
Yes.
He was an architect, but the concept of the architect didn't even exist at the time.
Yeah.
These were people that make the world that we live in. Yet somehow it feels like we're kind of siloing things. People were responsible for strength, people were responsible for utility, and other people were responsible for beauty.
Yeah.
Is it shifting now to come back to all three working together?
I think it hasn't, and it isn't fast enough. I think that separation is what caused many of our problems, and I think it has to shift back. It's kind of being Renaissance man if you talk about let's go all the way back and be builder, developer, everything else. But I think that part of the loss of that whole game, and Vitruvius in particular, to assume an engineer doesn't think of beauty is ludicrous. You might not want to share your taste, that's a different thing. But we think of beauty as well, but it's been separated and specialized in so many little fragments, and this is why the lecture I did was called Togetherness. How can we get back to, you don't have to go backward and use spades to do it. You can use the new technologies that we've got available to unite, find a new framework to unite for a better world. And I think that's a role that engineers should now take up in collaboration with other people. I'm not a fan of single disciplinary leadership of any sort, and egos get into it too much. I was triggered in 2020 when one of my favorite architects in Domus, David Chipperfield, asked Jack Herzog, what could we do about the climate? And his opening line was nothing as architects. And I thought, my God. I mean, he went to explain why he said it, but I just thought, have we got that far that even geniuses like this architect think we have no role to play? I mean, engineers are even more silent about it. I feel it's important in the world of design, which is quite a difficult word anyway, to engage beyond engineering.
I want to go back to togetherness there. Did you prescribe a solution? Are there some initial steps that we can take? You talked about technology being an opportunity.
I didn't prescribe, but I said that we shouldn't just worry, we shouldn't be doomed by it. Technology got us here. We know that. The Industrial Revolution and all the rest. We couldn't have done without that. But we ought to find technology now to get us back out of it. It won't do the whole job. Humans have to really be inspired by it. But one of the things I was trying to explain is how the separation means we're not all talking about the same thing. We all understand there's a climate crisis, but none of us really are talking to each other enough. And it's a transdisciplinary problem that we ain't going to solve through disciplines. And technology can unite us. Technology can find new ways. So I was showing examples of work where we've managed to take existing buildings, Regent's Crescent, not far from here, and added to them, or the American Embassy. But equally, new buildings, which some people say we shouldn't build towers. I was able to show why you ought to build towers. Why can't you build towers in India where you need them? You just need to do them better. And we have a responsibility from the West to look at that, or the global North, to look at that and inform them on all our mistakes. They might take us up on it, and at least they will not get it as wrong as we did. So the togetherness was that, and the other togetherness was really the next generations are so worried, because I teach a lot, and you see it, and I'm beginning to see a turn in the last 3 or 4 years. They are now becoming more and more optimistic and careful. 5 years ago, don't build. I don't want to do architecture. I don't want to do it. But now there are some very smart younger generation people who know they have no choice but to be sustainable.
I think that's fascinating, the whole don't build. If we're also concerned about the environment and the impacts that obviously the building and construction industry can have, it can be very tempting to be like, well, no, we should stop building anymore. We just need to look at reuse or repurposing. I mean, how do you strike that balance? When is the right time to build?
I think that it depends where you are. So cities like London were built on cities like London. London has a history of being built on itself, and there are many European cities like this in the West. You can't impose that on the 40 new cities they're going to build in India or in Saudi Arabia, where they're doing huge projects. I think you have to make a choice. But equally, when you're building new, if you just go and say, don't do it, people are not going to listen. If you tell them how you could do it better and differently, that is the way to go about it. London still is a really good canvas for both new and old because of its history. And it allows, cities like New York rely on us for some imagery and stuff. But on the whole, you have to take each problem at a time. By carte blanche saying don't build, retrofit only, is bizarre. And I've been framing this into a unified way, which I call advanced reverse design, and saying, look back at the past, don't rely on it, but look at the technology we now have. Codes of practice have changed. So things that were 300 years old, if you go back and look at it, you could do all sorts of things to it because we have new codes. We have forensic lens now to look at. We have new technologies, and it tells you how we can change things, even on existing buildings. So why can't we use those methods in new and old? And I blame us engineers for putting too many roads all over the world and the car becoming the thing that destroyed most of the world.
So engineers have something to answer for.
Of course. No, it's penance to some extent. You know, what my thinking in the last 5 or 6 years has come from having the success of having built a lot and then saying to yourself, yeah, okay, next stage of life, but actually all these next generation people have a right, and why wouldn't I want them to be engineers and architects like I have succeeded in that world? Why wouldn't I want to do that? So that penance has kind of brought me to thinking this way, and I think the Soane Medal, in a way, is a good intersection to say, okay, let's look at this man, Soane, and look at what he did, and then find people who can follow. You don't have to stand on his shoulders. You can't do that. But things he achieved can be achieved by multiple generations. We're not in the same world anymore. You know, when he was around, you couldn't do calculations. He had to do all that himself. World is different today. So I'm very hopeful and certain from a science perspective, but also as a human being, that we can do it. Nothing is inevitable. You know, if people tell you that this is going to happen, you can change. And the climate problem is that. The reports in 2020, 2019 told us we've made too much material. They told us there was a problem coming, but they didn't say it's doomed, what they were saying, and people have misunderstood it. Here are 7 or 8 pathways that we should start to take now. And if we take those pathways, let us hope, total hope. And in fact, face it, that we will have a climate crisis. But how do we mitigate? How do we deal with it rather than, which is what our great-grandfathers had to do as well. We're not the only ones. It's just catastrophic this time and cataclysmic in a way, so we cannot berate the urgency. Equally, by just moaning about it, manifestoing all the time, I think it doesn't work. I think disciplines can help. Education is the key to this. We will get there. And that's why I do what I do and say what I say.
That was Hanif Kara, and we'll rejoin my conversation with him later in the program. I'm joined now in the studio by Maylee Evans. Maylee, super producer of Monocle on Design. What have you got for us?
Today I've brought a report I did recently when I was in Amsterdam. I went to the studio of Rive Roshan. So I was there for Glue Amsterdam, which is like a design-led route across the city, and this was one of the stops along the way. Rive Roshan was really intriguing, and I think the one word I would use to summarise my time spent there was wonder.
I like that, because you were literally wandering through the streets. But I'm also assuming you're using wonder as in W-O-N-D-E-R.
Yes, very much in the magical sense, because what I found is a lot of the pieces that were in there, they were having a sort of exhibition going through their archives, bringing together lots of pieces that have been created for various exhibitions across the world. So it's almost a moment of reflection. But what I found was just with every piece, looking at it and with every movement around a work, I would get a sort of slightly different perspective. Light would reflect slightly differently. And you would just think, how have they done this? Or what are the processes involved in making an object like this?
Perspective is an interesting, word to choose there. I think partly looking at these notes, I see Iranian, Australian and Dutch background. So there's a range of different perspectives feeding into this studio that's creating products that you can look at with a host of different perspectives. Is that fair?
I think that's fair. But I think the range of materials they used was so varied. It wasn't a case of being able to spot a signature material or a signature way that something would be done. It felt like throughout the pieces on show, there was a real curiosity to continue experimenting, to not rest on laurels, and to keep pushing, I guess, manufacturing techniques and seeing where they could be taken to next.
Amazing. So if they were musicians, it's not like you're going to have their old stuff is better than their new stuff. It's just all cool stuff.
No, it feels like concept albums after concept albums, and I'm very much here for it.
Concept album after concept album. That sounds amazing. And I know they're looking at the interplay of light, colour, space and material, but maybe it's better to hear it straight from them. So let's join you in the studio of Rive Roshan now.
How can you surprise someone when they look at something? We believe that when you do that, you stop people along their tracks, and that makes people think for themselves or curious, and we think that's really important. I'm Soane Roshan, and I'm from Rive Roshan. We're an artistic design studio based in Amsterdam, and I run it together with my partner Ruben. It's funny because we did really start out in London, and London really kicked off this desire. We were there during the Olympics in 2012. We had this feeling, you were surrounded by creatives, there was a lot of buzz going on. It really inspired us to do our thing. We were based in like an old warehouse in Seven Sisters, so North London. And in that time, we were actually making things that were really suited to this warehouse living style. And we were working with textile because it was just too difficult to move things around in that city. And you also had great manufacturers and things like that. I think the place that you're in, your surroundings, they really influence what you make. And like now we're really situated on water, and Amsterdam's really a city about water. So our work really reflects that. We try to capture that essence of nature and that reflection and the light that you see.
We start in the centre of the studio, where space in between table, a hued glass form mesmerises the eye. It's a work that encourages you to keep circling it, to see how light and reflection continue to alter.
When we started to make these, we actually wanted to make objects that capture everything that's around them, but at the same time they move with you when you walk around them as well. We often start from the perspective of the experience that we want to create. So not even the material or the functionality, but really what do we want to make people feel? Or how do we want to shift a space?
This piece feels so vastly different to the next works to catch my eye. A series of vessels made from 3D printed sand and impossibly pleated with sinuous curves as if caught mid-motion. It's a work that brings a humble, ancient material into the present, thanks to technological innovation.
They're really industrially produced, so they're made in a factory that makes really large-scale engine parts. They use the sand to cast as a mold for metal. But what we wanted to do is keep the sand as the end product. And what we thought so nice about sand is that, like, usually it's a material that blows away, but here it's really hard. We wanted to capture that softness and movement of sand, but in a vessel. When we first discovered this manufacturing process and the idea of being able to work with sand as a material, we actually thought, well, how do we capture the essence of the material, sand? And sand is free. If you hold it in your hand, it tries to seep out. So we actually wanted to create objects or sculptures, let's say, that are moving when you look at them. We like that contrast of like something that's really strong, but it's made out of a material that feels very soft, and it implies that softness in its form. The reason we made these vessels is because when the women life freedom movement started in Iran, like my heritage is Iranian, I really wanted to do something that could express the melancholy of that lack of freedom in Iran and the reason that my family left Iran, the fact that women, they can't dance, they can't sing, they can't be free. So we actually wanted to create these pieces that capture this essence of freedom and movement, and so we call them the Voices vessels.
The team at Rive Roshan are unafraid of incorporating bold colour or graphic design. That said, these objects are balanced. The colour never feels overwhelming or affronting to the eye.
We really believe in like this contrast of natural and almost like artificial in a way. We love when you combine like bright colours with something like sand. The sand pieces are very natural. We feel very calm when we look at them. When you work with bolder graphic colors, it surprises you, it catches your attention, but it doesn't become too loud and too bold. And I think that's something we're always looking for in the way we present our work. We like that contrast. And color is a really big part of what we do, and it's very intuitive. When we create something, we can't really say, oh, this is right or this is wrong. It evolves through an intuitive process. And our team as well, we work together to sort of understand what we feel is going to work. We have different intuitions. It's an interesting process with color. And it's always, I think it's the hardest to really be satisfied or feel like something's working. It takes a lot of experimenting and looking at options and comparing.
What is it like having all of these pieces here in one place?
For us, we usually, when we display or exhibit our work, we really think about the whole experience. If we make, for example, those tables, those sculpture block tables that I showed you, they've really been made for the space that was around them. It's always a big surprise when we bring a piece and put it in a new context, because it often reflects or it plays with the light that's around it, and that light is different wherever you go. It's almost like a collage of our work.
Looking forward to the future, what are you interested in at the moment in exploring, or where are you finding your curiosity taking you?
A lot of these smaller pieces that we've made, we're actually working on evolving them into larger scale installations and telling their stories in a deeper and more impactful and more genuine way. When you have an object that serves a function, even if it's sculptural, but you look at it from a functional perspective, it's quite hard to focus on the essence of the piece. We're really looking at a lot of our projects at the moment and seeing okay, what was the essence and how can we actually capture that in the most ultimate form?
At the time this report airs, the team of Rive Roshan will be in the United States, launching work as part of a group exhibition at this year's Design Miami. Undoubtedly, in this new environment, the works they showcase will once again shift perspectives and pique curiosity. But for now, for Monocle, in Amsterdam, I'm Maylie Evans.
And now we rejoin my conversation with this year's Soane Medal winner, Hanif Kara. In addition to leading his very own design-led engineering practice, Hanif is also a teacher in the architecture faculty at Harvard. And in some ways, he kind of embodies all these kind of contradictions and disciplines that the industry typically silos, whether that's academic and professional, engineer and designer. He kind of brings it all together. And I wanted to find out what the next generation of architects and engineers might look like.
I mean, the first thing is all of the professional rules of conduct are out of the window for all of those disciplines. So individuals and education systems that accept that previous models are no longer just going to be enough. They have to arm themselves with a lot more technology. They have to arm themselves with moral and critical thinking, which is not something a computer can do. And I think those people look to me like people who have a much bigger opportunity as a consequence of having to solve this massive problem. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when we started our practice, the problems were smaller and we saw it as an opportunity and we've been very successful. Today's opportunity is actually bigger if you don't give up on it, educate yourself. So I encourage people to, understand science and the humanities at the same time, because you can't be one or the other. And I'm seeing that quite a lot in the next generation of students. They understand politics a little better than I did. They talk about all sorts of other stuff.
And maybe this is a little bit of a silly question, but why should engineers care about the humanities, care about politics, care about the arts?
Because it's one world and one nature, and the planet is our client. Let's not forget that. It's good to make money, it's good to build great buildings, great to win awards, but ultimately the quality of life of all of the people of the world has to be a driving force. And I have only later in life, after being less busier on doing my practice, have begun to pick up on that. because I think that requires a different compass as an engineer. And when you go back to academy and you put it to the great thinkers, I believe that they will start to bring those things together again. It's not new. Medieval times, there was a very coherent summa where there was no specialization. You had to do everything. I'm not saying they got it right, but why can't we go a little bit further back rather than this pace at which we've gone at the moment where everything needs a specialist? You know, that's part of the fragmentation. You thin slice it so much that you end up with a big mess. And that's, I think, been the biggest problem with technology creating the current problem in, say, concrete making, yeah? Ubiquitous material. Why didn't we ever stop and think, well, how can we improve it? Now we're being forced to change it. It can capture carbon. It can do all sorts of other things. Once the market tunes back to that and realizes it can't carry on what it's doing, there is a success plan in place with these things, with scientists and technologists, with concrete. The Global South's not going to stop pouring it.
But I mean, that's quite fascinating. And to, I guess, illustrate and reiterate your point, I had a similar experience earlier this year in Dubai Design Week. There was an architect there who had developed a cement mix using brine, which is a huge waste product in the UAE from all their desalination plants. And I think the point being that if he hadn't been clued into like this broader picture of waste, he might not have considered brine as a material to use as a binder.
I couldn't agree more. And if he hadn't done that, and many will, you wouldn't break the stranglehold of the cement makers. You know, there are 2 big cement makers in the world. They're going to take a lot of turning. And it's people like this are beginning to show that if they don't do it, they're out of business sooner or later. And that's the speed that I would like to take, that kind of conversation.
We've talked a little bit about, you know, the new generation and students coming through, but people that are operating in silos now, engineers perhaps that are operating in silos, what can they do? What steps can they start to take to maybe shift the way that they're practicing into this more collaborative means?
They need to be broader thinkers. Stop saying things like we must not build tall buildings. Let's not build. There are 3 billion people or 2 billion people in informal housing. Stop doing those headline things to get work. You know, there are people who said in London we shouldn't build any more towers. Actually, a very elegant tower has appeared in Canary Wharf with Herzog de Meuron and us. Beautiful. Market drives that. So my encouragement to them is actually come out, come and talk about these things and then take it back to your offices. Don't specialize in adaptive reuse. That's something that 5,000 years ago people were doing. And London, it's not a new thing. Retrofit is not a new thing. Just come out and find the big wins if we can. And materials are one direction, but the conversation is far more important because that's where I think the fracture is. You know.
It seems that so much of this is actually about conversation. It's not about, you know, calculations or forms or, you know, when you've described yourself as a therapist previously, I've read some of your other interviews. It sounds like it's just about talking. Is it maybe not that simple, but is that really the key to all of this?
I do. And that talking has to be at universities and graduates, but also at the capital level. You know, go and talk to your governments, your mayors, explain. We've done a very successful project in Houston, Texas, just about to open next year. And it flooded eight weeks ago with a new hurricane. Within 24 hours, the flood had disappeared from our site, but the rest of Houston was still flooded. So it was a conversation with the mayor, with the city, that our site, we're going to protect it like this, and this is what's going to happen. I begin to see the mitigation and adaptations, which has to accept that we're going to have a problem. And then how do we deal with it? If you're lucky, you get tested very quickly, like we did with the flood. And I do feel, in closing kind of way, that the more we speak, the better. And I try to do that, even though it might annoy some people. I feel that it's something that I can contribute to.
Is there a listening component as well?
Without a shadow of a doubt. And that's the dilemma. I'm more of a listener. And then I reapply what I've heard, you know, process it and reapply, take from other people what I've heard and put a component of mine. It's not always about me. I try to make the other person look better than they are often, right? I've learned to listen. I've learned to listen very well, and it's the fortunate thing that I've worked with so many amazing people, architects, landscape architects, clients, that they've given me that platform to soak this stuff in that I can now bring out.
Hanif Kara, And that's all for today's show. For more design stories, listen to our 5-minute midweek bonus show, Monocle on Design Extra, which airs on Thursdays. And if you enjoy print, then do pick up a copy of Monocle magazine as well. It's on all good newsstands now. Today's episode was produced and edited by Maylee Evans. I'm Nick Manise, and you can reach me on nm@monocle.com. Thanks for listening.